What if I told you the US just launched a strike on Burkina Faso and it could ignite an Africa-wide uprising? At 5:42 a.m., Yatenga's sky ripped apart, not by rain, but by fire. 3 dead, a relay station in ruins, and the dust of sovereignty choking the air. Washington calls it necessary. Ouagadougou calls it war on our right to exist. This is the part they never wanted you to see. When the news broke, most Western outlets framed it as a precision strike against a suspected militant hub. But in Ouagadougou, the people knew better. This was not about militants, this was about message. And Ibrahim Traoré's message came fast, a televised address delivered without teleprompter, without hesitation. Let the world know, the sovereignty of Burkina Faso is not negotiable. If they believe their bombs will bend us, they have miscalculated the spirit of our ancestors. We will not kneel to a foreign power, not today, not ever. Those words hit harder than the missile itself. Markets froze, analysts scrambled. In embassies across West Africa, foreign officials whispered, had Traoré just declared an open challenge to the United States? For ordinary Burkinabe, there was no doubt. They saw in him the reflection of Thomas Sankara's courage, the defiance of a man who understands that freedom has no safe mode. The strike was meant to break him. Instead, it lit a fuse. In the villages beyond Ouagadougou, word spread faster than radio waves. Farmers in dusty fields paused their work, mothers gathered children around flickering televisions, and elders leaned in to hear every syllable from their young president. Traoré's defiance became a spark, and sparks, in Africa's dry season, do not stay still. Within days, rallies erupted in Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry. Crowds waved both their national flags and the red-green-gold of Pan-African unity. Social media lit up with a single rallying cry, "Africa is not for sale." In Dakar, university students painted murals of Traoré alongside Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba. In Accra, market women refused to sell imported wheat for a day, demanding instead that the government back African farmers. Even in Johannesburg, thousands marched, chanting, "Our land, our rules." And Western analysts dismissed it as temporary unrest. They were wrong. This was the early rhythm of a continental heartbeat, the sound of nations realizing they were not alone. For the first time in decades, leaders once cautious of offending their foreign backers began to speak differently. A new alignment was forming, one not written in Washington or Paris, but in the dust and determination of African streets. The West had thrown a stone. Africa was building a wall. The strike had left smoke in the sky, but in the villages, it left something more dangerous: resolve. Traoré did not call for protests. He called for preparation. In the rural north, where the Sahel winds scraped the skin, radio stations began broadcasting a simple message: defend the land, protect the grain, the storm is coming. Trucks without plates rolled through dusty roads at night, not with soldiers in uniform, but with farmers, miners, and traders. Each carried tools, rations, or spare parts, as if an invisible hand was moving pieces on a chessboard. Satellite images later revealed it: new defensive lines, fresh supply caches, and communication relays stretching hundreds of kilometers. Western intelligence marked them as unusual activity. Locals called it something older: Kaya, the gathering before the storm. While troops quietly shifted, Traoré struck in a place no missile could reach: the economy. Within weeks, foreign mining firms received notices all gold exports were suspended, pending national audit. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Burkinabe, it was precision surgery. Gold, once extracted for pennies and flown abroad, now stayed in national vaults. The sudden supply shock rattled markets in London and Dubai. Then came the second blow, a new West African grain pact signed in Ouagadougou. With Mali and Niger on board, the Sahel's wheat, millet, and sorghum were redirected away from Western buyers toward African states in need. The message was clear: if you try to starve us, we will feed ourselves first. Western analysts had expected retaliation on the battlefield. Instead, Traoré hit them in boardrooms and trading floors, where their influence was meant to be absolute. It was no longer a question of whether Burkina Faso could defend itself, it was whether the West could withstand a war it did not control. By late afternoon, the heat over Kaya had become a living thing, a dense, heavy weight that pressed down on rooftops, seeped into walls, and clung to skin like a damp shroud. The air shimmered above the red dirt roads, distorting the outlines of the distant hills. Even the goats moved slowly, their shadows long and thin against the dust. On a normal day, this was the busiest hour for the town's heart, the marketplace. By now, merchants should have been shouting over each other, their voices rising above the clink of coins and the rustle of fabric. The smell of fried plantains and roasted groundnuts should have drifted from cooking stalls. Children should have been darting between vendors, slipping past baskets of okra and towering sacks of millet. Elders should have been seated under faded umbrellas, bargaining over each grain as though the price determined the fate of the world. But today, the marketplace was a ghost of itself. The noise was gone. The air was thick with a different kind of heat, not just from the sun, but from unease. In the long shadows cast by the town's lone minaret, figures moved. They wore no uniforms. They carried no flags. Their sandals raised no more than a whisper from the dust. They did not call attention to themselves. Instead, they slipped between alleys, lingered in doorways, and scanned the crowd with eyes that did not match their smiles. These men did not come in trucks or armored convoys. They arrived in small numbers, quiet as the wind. They spoke softly to shopkeepers, sometimes buying small goods, sometimes offering help with heavy loads. But their words were not idle chatter. They were seeds, planted in the minds of those willing to listen. A merchant with a trembling hand shut the wooden door of his shop far earlier than usual. He had seen this before, men who introduced themselves as traders, travelers, or cousins from another town. Men whose sandals carried the dust of distant roads and whose eyes flickered toward every shadow. They came with soft words and friendly gestures, but after they left, the air in the village changed. Trust dissolved, fear spread, and, before long, someone's home would burn in the night. This was not an army in the traditional sense. No marching lines, no banners fluttering in the wind, no bugle calls. This was the invisible siege, a slow and patient invasion not measured in territory taken, but in loyalties stolen. It was the careful replacement of faith with suspicion, the weaving of new allegiances under the cover of everyday life. Traoré's intelligence officers, who had learned to read the smallest shifts in village life, whispered the same phrase to each other over and over: foreign fingerprints, but African faces. The tactics were old, divide, and weaken, but the players were new, men who had been trained, supplied, or paid by hands far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Outsiders who knew they could never control the land unless they first controlled the people who lived on it. When the report reached Traoré's desk in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere in the presidential war room thickened instantly. The room fell silent, not the stunned silence of surprise, but the heavy quiet of recognition. Everyone present understood what this meant. The enemy was no longer at the border. They were inside. Maps of Burkina Faso lay spread across the long presidential table, their creases worn from years of being folded and unfolded. Red pins marked the places where these whispers had taken root, dots scattered across the Sahel, the scrublands, the river valleys. Some of these villages had resisted, their elders standing firm against the subtle coercion. Others had begun to falter, their trust in the central government eroding like soil in a hard rain. In the dim light, Traoré stood over the maps, his hands braced against the table's edge. "This," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed, is no longer about guns and uniforms. This is about hearts, about trust. If they take that, they don't need to take our land. The generals in the room listened, without interrupting. They knew he was right. They had fought battles before, battles that could be won with bullets, ambushes, and armored trucks. But this was something harder, something slower, a war for the invisible threads that tied a people together. That night, Traoré's strategy shifted. Orders were written and signed, not in the language of pure military tactics, but in the language of human connection. No village is too small to defend. If there was a single family still loyal to the state, they would be protected. Every elder must be heard before every battle. The wisdom of the old could decide whether a community stood united or fell from within. Every school rebuilt before every speech given. If the people saw that their children's future mattered more than political posturing, no whispered lie could uproot that trust. The mission was no longer just to repel attacks. It was to make the people unshakable, so that even if enemy operatives stood in their doorways, their words would find no fertile soil. Over the following weeks, the plan unfolded. Military patrols stopped rushing through villages and began sitting down in them. Soldiers shared meals with farmers, repaired fences, and joined in planting fields. State engineers were sent ahead of convoys to repair wells, fix generators, and restock medical clinics. Traoré knew that foreign powers could topple a regime with bullets. That had been proven many times in Africa's history, but they could never truly conquer a people who believed, deep in their bones, that they were worth defending. And so, in the heat of Kaya, and in countless other towns like it, the quiet war continued. But this time, the whispers met resistance. The strangers in sandals still came, still smiled, still offered their careful words, but they found villagers who nodded politely and then walked straight to the local defense post to report what they'd heard. The siege was not over, but the seeds of fear were meeting a new crop, the seeds of unity. The air in Ouagadougou that day was dense and heavy, not only with the weight of the late-season heat, but with something harder to define, an almost electric tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the city. The wind was sluggish, carrying dust in lazy swirls across wide boulevards and narrow backstreets alike. Yet even in that stillness, there was motion, small, deliberate, cautious. Across the capital, people moved with an unspoken awareness, as though some invisible threshold had been crossed and nothing would ever be the same. The strike had left no visible crater in the heart of the city, yet its aftershocks were everywhere. In the way men paused mid-conversation when soldiers passed by, in the way shopkeepers kept one eye on their customers and another on the street, in the way the very air seemed to hold its breath. The markets, normally a roaring chorus of haggling voices and clattering coins, remained open but subdued. Vendors spoke in low tones behind stalls draped with faded tarps, their eyes flicking toward every unfamiliar face. Hands that normally gestured with confidence now worked with a quiet, mechanical rhythm, measuring rice, weighing mangoes, tying up parcels, not to draw attention. In the residential quarters, mothers kept their children indoors, away from the sun and from questions they weren't ready to answer. Laughter was absent from the streets. Even the stray dogs seemed unsettled, their ears twitching at distant noises, their movements erratic as they padded along walls and ducked into alleys. Inside the presidential palace, the air was cooler but no less charged. The war room was lit in stark, bright tones, the mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen. On it, a constellation of maps, intelligence briefs, and printed satellite images lay spread wide. Colored markers circled key supply routes. Thin red lines traced known infiltration paths. Small notations in the margins recorded movements, alliances, betrayals. At the head of the table sat Ibrahim Traoré. His posture was still, almost statuesque, but his eyes moved constantly, measuring, cross-referencing, absorbing. He was young, but there was no trace of hesitation in the way he studied the material before him. He was a man who understood that in moments like this, a single mistake could cost not just a battle, but the future. Every mark on the map told a story, some of loyalty, others of treachery. A village elder who had resisted foreign bribes, a commander who had quietly shifted allegiance, a neighboring patrol route now in friendly hands. In the wake of the strike, the line between ally and adversary had blurred into something fluid and dangerous. The Americans had forced his hand. Burkina Faso could no longer afford to stand in a purely defensive stance, waiting for the next move. Yet Traoré did not rush. He let the silence grow, long and deliberate, the way a hunter allows the prey to step fully into the clearing before releasing the arrow. His advisors shifted in their seats, aware that decisions of enormous consequence were being weighed in that stillness, because Traoré understood something that the West had not yet grasped. This was no longer just about the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. It was not even solely about the Sahel. This battle had widened into something far greater, a struggle for the future of the African continent itself, its unity, its dignity, its right to stand unbowed. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon, bleeding gold into the red dust of the city. As night fell, Ouagadougou's streets glimmered with scattered pools of light from street lamps and cooking fires. But in the palace, the war room only grew brighter. Generators hummed, screens flickered. The table was now more crowded. Advisors from Mali, Niger, and Guinea stood shoulder to shoulder with Burkinabe officers. Some were old allies forged in the heat of shared battles. Others were new partners, drawn in by the shock of the strike and the realization that the threat facing Burkina Faso did not end at its borders. On the largest wall screen, satellite images shifted every few seconds. Convoys on desert roads, thermal scans of border crossings, blurred photographs of men in plain clothes meeting in market stalls. Supply routes glowed in thin, pulsing lines, arteries of trade, of arms, of influence. Representatives from the African Union, who had once approached Traoré with a mixture of diplomatic caution and political skepticism, now regarded him differently. There was still a note of calculation in their eyes, but also something new, a reluctant respect and perhaps a hint of fear. When the decision came, it came quietly. Traoré did not slam his fist on the table or raise his voice. He simply straightened, looked at the gathered officers, and spoke in the calm, steady cadence of a man stating a law of nature. Allied forces will move at dawn. Every border crossing is to be secured, and if they strike again, they will find not a divided Africa, but an unbroken shield. The words landed like the closing of a steel gate final, immovable. In the seconds that followed, no one spoke. Those in the room understood at once. This was no longer a defensive posture. This was the moment Burkina Faso, and those who stood with it, would take the fight beyond their own frontiers. Not as aggressors, but as guardians of an entire continent's right to exist free of foreign chains. The news spread faster than any official communiqué could be drafted. It ran through the corridors of the palace, carried on the lips of aides and messengers. It raced down phone lines and over encrypted radio channels. In military camps across the Sahel, soldiers began checking weapons and fueling vehicles under the pale light of makeshift flood lamps. Mechanics worked through the night on armored trucks. Medics laid out supplies with practiced hands. In remote villages, where news often traveled no faster than the rhythm of a drum, elders gathered by firelight to pray for victory, not just for their own, but for the land their children would inherit. Young men whispered about joining the fight. Women prepared food and water for the troops they knew would pass through by dawn. And far away, in a darkened office in Washington, a single realization began to take shape. Somewhere between the neatly typed intelligence assessments and the cold glow of classified satellite feeds, an American analyst leaned back in his chair and understood the magnitude of what had been set in motion. The strike, meant to send a warning, had instead struck something far deeper, a nerve that ran the length of Africa itself. What had been awakened was not an army. It was an idea, and ideas once roused, are harder to kill than any enemy on a battlefield. The footage of Ouagadougou's uprising spread like wildfire, not just across Africa, but across the globe. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Harare to Cairo, the streets echoed with chants that mirrored those heard in Burkina Faso. Our land, our people, our destiny. African leaders, some quietly supportive, others visibly shaken, watched the new wave of defiance. This was no longer just about one strike or one country. It was about rewriting the terms of engagement between Africa and the world. Ibrahim Traoré, once painted in Western headlines as an isolated military leader, had become a symbol, a rallying point for a generation, tired of old bargains and silent submission. His speeches, streamed live from the heart of Ouagadougou, weren't just political addresses, they were declarations of sovereignty. In Ghana, students marched with Burkinabe flags. In South Africa, miners laid down their tools in solidarity. In Nigeria, journalists risked censorship to broadcast the full story of the strike and its aftermath. The continental pulse was alive. On a stormy evening, with the African sky bruised purple and gold, Traoré stood once again before his people. This time, the words carried a gravity that silenced the square. The days when Africa's fate was decided in foreign capitals are over. The price of our freedom will be high, but the cost of submission is far greater. Aiteng. Every sentence was followed by a roar, not of anger, but of unity. Farmers, soldiers, traders, mothers, students, all felt the truth in his voice. He issued a final message, not to his people, but to the powers watching from across the seas. Do not mistake our patience for weakness. This land will not be broken. Not by bombs, not by hunger, not by fear. The crowd erupted. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the first chapter of a continental awakening.